Welcome to your next lecture on the women's movements. Remember that we're looking at this in a global sense, but of course we will have quite a bit of information on the U.S. in regards to these women movements. Also, I will be adding a couple of clips to the playlist for this time period that you may want to look at after you finish watching this lecture that can expand upon some of the information that you're going to find in this lecture. So the AP wants you to know for 5.3 that the global spread of Enlightenment thought and the increasing number of rebellions stimulated new transitional ideologies and solidarities. One of those solidarities was the feminist movement. So in particular, they want you to understand Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication of the women's right, and then of course the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizen from France, and then the Seneca Falls Conference, which was held in the United States in 1848. So for women in politics, we go into, prior to the spread of democracy, the idea of women participating in government was very limited to the upper class. Upper class women oftentimes were advisors to their political husbands, or, you know, obviously we have a couple queens that we've discussed throughout the course, Queen Elizabeth of England, Queen Isabella of Spain, and then of course Catherine in Russia. So the idea of a woman in leadership position is not something that's foreign to the developed world or to the European Western countries. However, women were not being given any consideration in any of the revolutions that were taking place in the 1800s. So, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, Olympia de Gouges, what she was trying to do was basically expand the ideas of the Declaration of the Rights of Man into including women. And in fact, when she wrote her declaration, she really just added "and women" to a lot of the articles that were part of the declaration. So you guys have read the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and so what she did for most of those articles was just added "and women" to those articles. So one thing that she did say was that this revolution will only take effect when all women become fully aware of their deplorable condition and of the rights they have lost in society. The idea was expanding that idea of human rights that was being exposed through the Enlightenment that we saw with people like Voltaire or Rousseau, and adding women into that mix. It wasn't necessarily something new, but it was something that was not being considered. So while we were considering human rights for men in the Declaration of Rights of Man and through the revolutions and through, you know, even the U.S. Constitution, women were not included in any of that. Mary Wollstonecraft, she wrote a couple of pamphlets actually, and her main one was on the vindication for the rights of women. Mary Wollstonecraft has an interesting history in regards to why she would be a female advocate. One of those was actually the relationship she had with her father. Her father was abusive, and she oftentimes spent a lot of her, she writes about how she would sleep outside the door of her mother's bedroom to try to fend off her father. And she also helped her sister escape an abusive relationship and kind of make her way in the world alone, even with a child. So something that she saw growing up and into her adulthood was that women had no other options but to be married to whomever they were married to. That the idea of divorce was something that was absolutely insane and unheard of, and that divorced women were not allowed to remarry, and so they oftentimes had no options but to go into some type of working class situation, which was a very difficult existence, especially when you had children to support. So the idea of a woman leaving a situation that maybe would be abusive was so foreign to these women that it was not something that they would even consider doing. And Mary Wollstonecraft really encouraged that about women. Here's a quote from her. "Let it not be concluded that I wish to invert the order of things. I have already granted that from the constitution of their bodies, men seem to be designed by Providence to attain a greater degree of virtue. I speak collectively of the whole sex, but I see not the shadow of a reason to conclude that their virtues should differ in respect to their nature. In fact, how can they, if virtue has only one eternal standard? I must therefore, if I reason consequently, as strenuously maintain that they have the same simple direction as if there is a God. It's not that Mary Wollstonecraft wanted to change the way that society was running. It's not that she wanted to change the way that women were involved in politics or the way that women were involved in their social situations or their family roles. She wasn't asking to change gender roles. What she was asking was for some protection for women, that the extremeness of the family dynamic and the idea that women were property was what her problem was. It wasn't necessarily that it was that women were meant to be equal with men. That's not something that she was discussing. Neither of these documents will really have a huge following until later, as they were used through the suffragette movement. These documents will gain strength as we go through the suffragette movement, as we go through the feminist movement into the modern age. And neither of these women expected massive revolutionary changes for women's rights, but they thought that, hey, women's rights should be considered alongside those changes that were happening for men. The suffragettes were the women in Britain who were attempting to gain the right to vote. As Britain was reforming their voting rights, women decided that they should be included in that movement, and they were being ignored. Emmeline Pankhurst is one of the founding women of the suffragettes. The suffragettes is actually a political movement, a political group. And they started out with asking, speeches, typical ways that any type of new political group would start out. They, with articles in newspapers, with protests, with trying to bring light to their cause. No one was responding, and so the suffragettes moved into actually a violent way of gaining their rights. And one of them, an example of that, is Emily Davidson. Emily Davidson was a woman who showed up at a horse race in 1919 and was actually trampled by the king's horse on the track in front of, there's actually film of it. So we actually have film of this instance. So she gave up her life in order to gain the right to vote for women. The other thing that women were doing was, your typical violent movements, sit-ins and things of that nature. And the women started getting arrested. And the women, while they were in jail, would go on a hunger strike because they weren't making any progress. And the idea was that they were bringing press to their plight. And so what they were doing is they were going on these hunger strikes. The press was buying into it, saying that the government, because they were not granting these women what they wanted, that these women were slowly dying, and it was at the hand of the government. And so there's very bad press for the government, and so the government actually created a new law that said that right before they died, they were released. So these women would be released, they would start eating again, and then they would get arrested and go back into jail and start the whole situation over again. Ultimately, the suffragettes were successful. If you've seen the old Mary Poppins, you've probably actually seen the wife of Mr. Banks was a suffragette. And in the video clips, I'll put the song that they sing from Mary Poppins, so you can kind of hear what that movement was for Great Britain. Seneca Falls was in the United States, and it was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and basically it was a convention. And at the end of the convention, they published the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments was a list of, hey, this is what women want. And what Elizabeth Cady Stanton was saying was that women... What Elizabeth Cady Stanton was trying to say was that it's not that women were unequal, it's that we've become unequal as a result of lack of education. And one of the key parts of the Declaration of Sentiments was the access to education. What the Seneca Falls Convention really was about was trying to gain equal opportunity for women in regards to gaining an education, and it wasn't necessarily about voting rights. That would come later in the United States, but the first step was educating the women. New York actually passed, as a result of Seneca Falls, the Married Women's Property Acts in 1848, which stated that women were allowed to keep any property, as well as they had equal right to own any property gained through marriage. If there was, in the case of divorce. And then Pennsylvania actually followed with a law very similar to this. There were many states in the United States that slowly expanded the right to vote for women on a local scale, but it wasn't until 1919 that the entirety of the United States where women were given the right to vote. Here are some of the dates in regards to when women were gaining the right to vote. So 1903 was the first country to expand the right to vote on a national scale, and that was Australia. 1919 was in the United States. Today, more women than men vote in elections. So in the 2012 election, 53% of women voted and only 47% of men voted. And so you can see that the expansion of the right to vote for women is something that women are using and are taking advantage of. However, I still don't understand why 53% of women are voting. But of course, the United States has a very low voter turnout, even in something like a general election. I feel that the 2016 election will possibly bring out a lot larger numbers than we've seen in the past. In 1928, the UK decided that women could vote. It was on national scales, and it was slow. They changed the ages for the voting throughout time, and if you go into the playlist, you'll see another kind of explanation of the movement of the suffragettes, and it gives you more information about the actual British voting laws. The latest country to give women the right to vote was in 2015 in Saudi Arabia. The Muslim countries are starting to expand the right to vote to many women, and there are still a couple countries where women do not have access to voting rights. In the 1700s, education for women was limited. For the upper-class girls in Europe, they were taught to read and write by some type of governess or nanny. Middle-class families in Europe could only afford to educate boys, and there's no education for the lower class for boys or girls. So women, really upper-class women, were the only part of society that could read and write. In the United States, girls were sometimes taught by private tutors if your family could afford it, and this is something that's very, very expensive. Quakers are the exception. If you remember, Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. The Quakers educated both women and African Americans, and this is something significant to the abolitionist movement. You do not have the women's movement without the abolitionist movement in the United States, and vice versa. Your female women's movement leaders were also abolitionists, and your abolitionists were usually associated with some type of women's movement as well. In the 1800s, we see some changes as secondary schools were created for women, but what to teach and how to teach was limited, and how to do it was difficult because the schools were being overrun. So, for example, there was one academy in Massachusetts that one woman was teaching 157 girls. These schools were opened by single women who happened to have some type of money, and many states started to pass laws regulating what teachers could and couldn't do, and who could be teachers. To be a teacher in the 1800s in the United States and in most countries, you were not allowed to be married. The idea here is that as we shifted from teaching morality in the home, where parents were the ones who were responsible for teaching religion and right from wrong and things of that nature, we're shifting that into the hands of teachers. And as a result of that idea, people wanted the teachers to be kind of the purest form of human, which in religious belief was a single female woman. And so these women were held to a higher moral standard than the rest of society. Teachers had a really hard time catching up with what needed to be taught to girls because girls were so far behind in regards to education in general. Harvard actually started accepting women. This is the first university to start accepting women in 1836. Female universities started to be established in the late 1800s. Schools like Vassar were created in the late 1800s that gave women access to a higher education and into degrees. Believe it or not, one of the first fields that women were gaining degrees in medicine. Medicine is a caring field, and so it would make sense that women and mothers would go into this field. In the 1900s, we have massive changes. We have pre-World War II and post-World War II world. Compulsory education laws were starting to be created around the 1900s that allowed children from both genders and all social classes to be educated. Germany is the first country to really develop this idea with its kindergarten, and so that's why education really starts at that level, and when students are being taught how to learn how to read and write, starts really at the age of 5. However, being a teacher in the United States was very difficult. You couldn't teach if you were married because of that whole moral standard thing that I was talking about on the last slide, and teachers were paid very low wages. Teachers actually legally had to follow a specific dress code, including like how they wore their hair. Women were not allowed out in public. They were limited in regards to socializing and in socializing with men in particular. So the life of a teacher was very, very difficult, and being a teacher wasn't necessarily a positive choice for women. It was something that, was seen as a job for spinsters or for women who couldn't find a spouse, and so the idea of teachers being somewhat of a negative thing it starts here. Teaching eventually was unionized, which helped create a more systematic approach to education. So things like state curriculum programs developed as a result of the unions. And in 1941, laws banning women teachers from being married were lifted in most states. 1941. By 1910, women made up 39% of college students in the United States. So we see a major change there from the 1800s. And then World War II happened. World War II showed that women were capable of working, women were capable of fulfilling economic need in the United States and in most of your Western states as well, like in Great Britain. So in the post-World War II era, examples of changes are like in 1945, Harvard accepted the first female class into its medical school. Title IX was passed in 1972, which was legislation on equal access for women. So for example, in sports, the schools have to provide the same amount of girls' sports and boys' sports in order to equalize and show that there is gender equality in your school. And by 1980, 51% of college attendees were women. 1996, the Supreme Court ruled that Virginia military schools had to accept women. This is a huge change for the military programs in the United States. Women were not allowed in combat, and so this is going to change that, and women are now allowed on the front lines. Also, if you remember last year, there were 2 girls that graduated from Army Ranger School, and this is the first time we see women doing things like that. Today, women are still not allowed on submarines. That's something that's still restricted, and we'll see if something changes there. In 2012, 57.3% of all bachelor's degrees conferred were earned by women in the United States. So today, women are actually earning more degrees than men. Women are 33% more likely to earn a degree than men in the United States. That's partially because of the jobs that are available for the different genders. A lot of male jobs are still in mining or agriculture or primary sectors of the education of our economy, and so a lot of jobs that women are willing to take and women want to take are going to require degrees. So that's one of the reasons for that difference. One of the things that the UN measures when it's looking at its gender inequality index is how many women are sitting on legislative assemblies. So fewer women than men hold office in every country of the world, and the highest percentages are in your European states. The highest percent is actually in Rwanda. Rwanda holds the Rwandan Legislative Assembly. 49% of the Rwandan Legislative Assembly is made up by women. In the United States, 20 out of the 100 seats are women, and 84 out of the 435 House seats are women. In the election this year, 15 women are running for the 34 Senate seats that are available, and 91 women are running for the 435 House seats that are available. It's not so much that we don't vote for women. Women don't seem to run for office in the United States. You can look at the governors here. Currently, there's 6 female governors. 11 states have races in 2016, and only 6 women are running out of those states. So women just don't necessarily run for office in the United States. Here you can see a list of countries that I thought would be of interest to see where they rank in regards to women holding legislative seats. So like I said, Rwanda is at the top. Some interesting states that you kind of would not expect. Ethiopia, Afghanistan are higher than the United States. The UK is at 57, and then of course the United States is at 80 in regards to percent of seats held by women. Five point one discusses how industrialization changed things, and one of those things is family dynamic and gender roles. So these next couple of slides are going to be looking at that, and again we're going into the modern age as well. So women and family. In the pre-industrial societies, upper-class women were to run the house, but actually they wouldn't really run the house. They would tell their housekeeper how they wanted their house to look, and the housekeeper would actually do it. They would see their children at tea time for about an hour. That was it. The children were raised by nanny. They were raised by a female servant who was dedicated to these children. These nannies would not be married and would not have children of their own, but they were not really raised by their actual mothers. Middle-class women were a very small portion of society in the pre-industrial world, and children were involved in the daily running of businesses with middle-class families, so they spent a lot of time with their mothers. Peasant women spent a huge amount of time with their children. Everybody in the peasant class worked as an economic unit, and so family life was actually very strong in the lower class. In post-industrial society, things changed for the most part for working class women. We have a new class. We have a lower amount of peasants, and those women became working class women, and they wanted to limit the amount of children that they had. And contraceptives start to be invented in the late 1800s. The condom was actually created in the late 1800s as a way for working class women to protect themselves from pregnancy. If a working class woman would become pregnant, she would lose her job, and now she would have another mouth to feed. We actually see a huge rise in prostitution as a result of this within states like Great Britain and Germany and in other industrialized areas. Middle-class women entered the cult of domesticity and actually had a lot more hands-on experience with raising their children and running their own household. Nothing changed for the upper-class women. They still only saw their children for an hour at tea time. As far as women working, the job of the aristocratic women in pre-industrial society was looking the part for their husband's social standing. They spent a huge amount of time dressing. A woman would actually go through about 7 or 8 different outfits a day if you were an aristocrat. You had your breakfast outfit, and then you would go out for riding, you would go visit friends, you would have to change your clothes, then you would have your luncheon outfit, and then you would have your tea time outfit, and then you would have your dinner outfit. So it was constant changing of clothes. And believe it or not, that actually took a lot of time, and the clothing was, you could not put the clothes on and take them off by yourself, which is why we had the ladies' maid as a huge important job for women, for some of our lower class women. Again, the women were working with the businesses alongside their husbands, and the peasants were working along with their husbands in regards to maintaining basic needs. In industrial society, like I said, we have a new working class. Women were working in the factories alongside men, but they were paid less than men, and they were fired if they were pregnant. So the life of a working class woman was very unstable, and it was very difficult for working class women. In our post-industrial society, the peasant class is pretty much eliminated, and working class is pretty much staying the same. However, all of the laws that were being passed about working conditions, things like working hours and minimum wages and Social Security, things that Bismarck was doing in Germany in specific, extended to women as well. However, women were still being paid less. Post-World War I, during World War I, a lot of aristocratic women ran hospitals, especially obviously in Europe, and they continued those jobs as charity work. A lot of your aristocratic women started to work outside the home in regards to charity. They were not necessarily getting paid for these positions, but it became part of the social standing of the aristocracy for a woman to have a charity that she spent her time on. Some aristocratic women in the post-World War I era started to take on jobs. They were very different from their mothers' generations because these women were really the only ones that could read and write. And since there was a lack of men because of the war, there were available jobs to women, and they were taking secretarial positions as well. Middle-class women were growing, and they were getting jobs in the secretarial pool. They were getting jobs in teaching and in nursing, and all of that is because of World War I. So we see a shift where we have working-class women who were getting into what is now a lower middle class, and those lower middle class women were gaining jobs in the different fields that I was just talking about. And the cult of domesticity is going to continue for the upper middle class, as those upper middle class really tried to maintain their position in society as we get this new lower middle class. And then of course there's the impact of the Great Depression. The Great Depression really caused a loss of middle class for all over the world. And so we'll see a huge change, but World War II happened. So women went to work during the war on a large scale, and they actually learned new skills, which and showed that they could work in factories, that they could work in fields that men worked in, and that was a huge change for women. And the U.S. government actually funds daycare for the first time during World War II in order to give women an opportunity to fulfill the necessary jobs as our men were gone fighting overseas. In the post-World War II era, women actually went back home. They would work, a lot of women would work until they were married. Things like telephone operators, secretaries, nurses, teachers were all female jobs. My great aunt was actually a telephone operator. And my grandmother was a nurse, and but a lot of women, and then women were going into colleges and universities, but a lot of women would go back into the home in the 1950s. We have our baby boom as the men came back, and so women were having more children, which resulted from women leaving the workforce a little bit on a larger scale. The middle class continued to expand, and then, like I said, there was a little bit of a revitalization of the cult of domesticity as women were having more children. Now, this is obviously just in the United States. In the 1960s, gender becomes more of an identifier than your class. It's no longer upper, middle, lower class. It's more of your male or female in regards to work. And daughters of the baby boom worked more than their mothers did. These girls are going to go to colleges in the 1960s and actually use their degrees, where the women in the 50s were going to colleges and not necessarily using their degrees. They would go home. The changes in job sectors in the West impacted what jobs women took. We were, with mechanized farming and the efficiency of our industry, we didn't necessarily have to have so many people in our primary sectors, and so women were taking on more of the secretarial jobs, nurses, teaching. In the 1970s, women were a huge part of the working class in industrialized countries. So we have a new meaning for the industrial working class. We're no longer working in the factories. We are working in businesses. We have a consumer society with advertising as an option for women, which was a very creative field. And again, you still have your secretarial pool, which was very important to women gaining jobs. And again, a lot of women would just work until they got married, but women were getting married later, which is going to limit our family size. That starts in the 1970s, where, my grandmother, both my grandmothers, my grandmother on my mom's side had 10 children, my grandmother on my dad's side had 7 children. None of their daughters had more than 2 children. So you can see that there's just a huge shift within the 60s and the 70s. Most women are working what's called tertiary jobs. Tertiary jobs are desk jobs. They work in an office, in some type of field. Like, they are not out in the fields. They are not mining. They are not doing agriculture. In the 1980s, we have a huge movement of women into the workforce. The idea of working women has changed dramatically from the 1980s to the present. 2-income families, that was the mass consumerism of the United States. So to be middle class in the United States, you really needed 2 incomes. And the rising cost of daycare is now causing a shift back where a lot of women are actually leaving the workforce and going home for when the children are ages 0 to 5. When school starts, a lot of women will take on part-time jobs, and then again, as their children grow, they actually go back into their fields. Women are still getting college degrees, they aren't necessarily using them today. So, for example, the average daycare cost in the United States last year was $12,000 per child from the ages of 0 to 5. So until the child enters school, a family will spend about $60,000 on daycare. Now, that's an average. Obviously, you can find cheaper daycare, but this is something that U.S. families are facing. Here you can see some where U.S. women are working. So you can see that we tend to work in education and health services. 74.6% of jobs held by women are in education and health services. So you can see where men are working and where women are working. And like I was saying, men are working in mining, oil, gas, all that kind of stuff, and those do not necessarily require a degree. So again, that goes back to the idea of women getting more degrees than men today. Here you can see income associated with degrees. So you can see that women stall out. They don't necessarily, men will, if you look at the bachelor's degree versus an advanced degree, men will earn a huge amount of more money than a woman will, this is per week, with an advanced degree. Part of that is because women oftentimes stall in their careers when they do have children. They leave their careers for a short amount of time and then go back into the workforce and kind of have to start over. And so that happens on a large scale. And that is one of the reasons why there's so much income disparity here. Also, when you look at what fields women are working in, most states do require a master's degree in order to be a teacher. Florida is not one of them, but most states do require that. And of course, teachers are not earning as much as other fields, and so and nurses don't actually earn quite a very good income either, and so that also and a lot of nursing requires advanced degrees as well. So that again accounts for that parity or that inequality in regards to income. Here is a global visual on women in work and the disparity in their income. You can see that Korean women actually make almost 40% less than men, their male counterparts. So you can see the United States is in dark blue. So Belgium, if you are a woman and you want to make as much as a man, go work in Belgium. In non-industrial countries today, women in Asia are working in sweatshops as a large, for the most part, these are low-wage jobs and harsh working conditions, and they are working in these factories. One of the reasons for that is because they're willing to work in these harsh conditions, and a lot of your Asian countries do not have workers' rights laws like the United States does. Sub-Saharan African women work in agriculture, but they're not allowed to own the land. And we actually have a new thing happening from developed states called microcredit programs, where private investors will give women small loans to create some type of trade, some type of artisan type of job, which is helping to equalize women out in a lot of these underdeveloped countries. Another factor that the UN considers when looking at gender inequality is maternal health. Prenatal care actually became popularized in the post-World War I era in Great Britain. They created a whole sector of their government for public health for women. They were generally midwives, and they spent a lot of time in the underclass areas and the working class areas, making sure that the women and children in those areas were gaining the proper health and well-being for during prenatal time as well as immediately after birth. The until the 1970s, the idea that women were to give birth in a hospital really started in the 1950s and in the post-World War II era. And so from the 1950s up until the 1970s, actually, women were kind of knocked out during birth. Men were not in the room. It was, really a medical event. However, in the 1970s, there was a return to kind of midwifery, and the idea of giving birth is not necessarily associated with a medical event. And that idea came back in the 80s where it was a medical event, and then in recent years it started to change back to more home birthing, more natural birthing policies and processes throughout the developed world into the United States. What the UN actually uses is a maternal mortality rate, which is the number of women who die giving birth per 100,000 births. In most developed countries, it's 15 out of 100,000. In developing countries, it's 140 out of 100,000. The U.S. is at 14 out of 100,000, which is the highest in the developed world. And we've actually increased. A couple years ago, we were in the early 1990s, it was about 10 in 100,000. So we're the only country in the developing world that has an increasing maternal mortality rate. The reason for this is a couple reasons. Lack of access to good prenatal care is part of it. The rise of obesity. Obesity makes pregnancy complex and birth complex, and so that's part of it as well. We have an increased rate of gestational diabetes, which can cause problems within the birthing process. Also, women are more. In the 1980s, it was 1 in 5 births were through cesarean section, and now it's 1 in 3 births are through cesarean section. And the increased rate of C-section is really kind of because of medical malpractice suits. A lot of doctors are in fear of something going wrong in the birthing process, and so it's easier for the doctors to do a C-section rather than to allow a woman to go through the birthing process in a natural form. So a lot of doctors will encourage women to have C-sections over going through the natural birthing process. The Family Medical Leave Act was passed in 1993 in the United States, which gives family members 12 weeks of unpaid leave from their jobs if there is a medical reason for them to need to take care of a family member. And the birthing process is part of this Family Medical Leave Act. So the only guarantee is that you are allowed to take 12 weeks of leave to go and take care of your family, and you cannot be fired. Whether that leave is paid for or not is up to the individual companies. A lot of companies in the United States are changing their policies on this as of late. So, for example, Netflix has changed things. Some of the Google, Yahoo, a lot of your computer companies and anything associated with the internet are changing this policy. And they are paying their women for their time off when they do give birth to their babies. If you work for the United Nations, they are not under any laws, so they can kind of do what they want, and they actually give women 16 weeks of paid leave at 100% of their salary, and they also have 4 weeks of 100% salary of paternity leave as well. The United States is the only developed country that does not have federally protected paid maternity leave. Here is a visual of paid leave throughout the world. You can see your blue states are 52 weeks or more, so those countries actually offer more than a year off once you have a baby. And you can see the red states are no paid leave. So the United States and a couple other isolated areas do not offer any type of leave at all, paid leave for women. And you can see most of the developed world offers at least 14 to 25 weeks. The United States, the only protection women have when they do have a baby is 12 weeks of unpaid leave. You can see even in your patriarchal countries and like India and in your Middle Eastern countries offer some paid leave. It's less than 14 weeks. But this is paid leave, not necessarily again, in the United States, it's up to the individual company. So actually the best is Sweden. Sweden offers their 435 days of leave that you can share with the father of the child. So that is the longest, and it's actually at full pay. International Women's Day is celebrated on March 8th. It was begun by the UN in 1975. The idea is celebrating the accomplishment of women and bringing to light women's issues on a global scale. However, you do have to consider your Western bias. You have to decide as a voter whether or not the UN or the Western tendencies towards not liking patriarchy is something that culturally we should even be putting on other countries. In the United States, we protect culture. You have freedom of religion, you have gay marriage rights, you have these rights that are protecting cultural beliefs. However, we have a tendency to promote gender equality throughout the world. But that is a Western cultural tendency, and you have to decide whether or not you think that that is something that the Western world should be putting in place in other areas.